Okay, so our presentation is on why would the Nordic model work in the USA. So first thing we should get out of the way is, what is the Nordic model? The Nordic model is an economic system used primarily in Nordic countries such as Denmark, Finland, Norway, Iceland, and Sweden. And the Nordic model is primarily characterized by a few things, among them including public services such as free education, college, and universal health care. It is also characterized by high labor union density. In these countries, usually the government doesn't actually intervene in setting conditions for the workers. That's up to the employers and the workers to negotiate among themselves. And there is a rather high tax rate in these countries, with taxes in the range of primarily the 40s to the 50%. And because of the high tax rate, the government spending is also very high, with it being 56.6% of the GDP in Sweden. And because government spending is so high, there has to be low corruption.
So how exactly does the Nordic economic system operate? So as we said before, the five Nordic countries are Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. And the countries using the Nordic model employ a mixed market economic system. A large percentage of these workers, which is about 30%, are employed by the public sector. Governments tend to not interfere with the workings of private companies, not even to save even the super huge companies. So there's a society-wide risk sharing, which ensures that a safety net makes sure that no one is left behind in society.
So in comparison, let's look at the US. So the US employs a mixed economy model in where the government provides public services and subsidies to some sectors, but most of the economy is a laissez-faire economy. And the US government has two major tax sources, the individual income tax and the payroll tax. In 2020, the individual income tax system has 7 marginal income tax rates, as shown on the screen. And the majority of the taxes, the US uses the majority of the tax revenue, and that mostly goes into military, health programs, social security, and interest in federal debt.
So does the Nordic model work? So there's a GDP growth comparison between Sweden and the US. And at first glance, you could say, oh, it looks pretty much identical. But if you look closely at the scalings, you can see that the US has about 5 times as much economic GDP growth than Sweden. So this graph is a little misleading. So, and according to the 2020 World Happiness Report, you can see all the Nordic countries are in the top 10, and then you can see the US all the way at number 18.
There are many differences between the Nordic countries and the United States that might affect whether or not the Nordic model actually Nordic model actually works in the U.S. So a few characteristics of Nordic countries are their collective mentality. Citizens trust the government to create programs that benefit everyone, and citizens are okay with paying high tax rates as long as everyone benefits from them. And there's also a shared history in that most Scandinavian countries were formed through small businesses and family-driven agriculture, so they mostly faced similar challenges and they felt the solutions would be more likely to benefit the general population. So the Nordic model was developed after Europe was recovering from World War II, and Norway adopted social democracy in part because they wanted to respond to potential peak oil concerns in the future. And Nordic countries are more accepting of a social safety net, which basically means that which is different than in the United States because of some sentiment over fears of social safety nets. And also, there is high unionization, which means that unions are able to ensure that workers get their way in the Nordic countries without government intervention. And however, in the United States, things are quite different. Since World War II, the United States has not adopted social democracy or many of its practices. Instead, it's closer to Chicago school neoliberalism, thanks in part to economic trends in the 1980s. The US has also always had a more laissez-faire market approach, which generally stems from the American values of self-reliance and individualism, which are quite in contrast to the Nordic countries' values of collectivism, more or less, and helping out with their community. And the US also has lower unionization rates and tax rates than the Nordic model and does not provide many social services such as healthcare and free college. So the Nordic model we conclude, would not work in the United States. Nordic countries generally have smaller population and there is more fraternity between people in Scandinavia relative to here. So people are more likely to accept and give social help. The US also has a culture of individualism, or as many people say, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. So social safety nets wouldn't be as valued here as opposed to in the Nordics. And finally, fiscal conservatives have a higher proportion in the US, so any legislation that might reach us to the Nordic model would likely have to go a long way through Congress.
And this is our bibliography.